Initial presentation, and good afternoon everyone from Spain for this second webinar dedicated to new business models and policy recommendations to integrate more efficiently the effect of flexibility of big industry or industrial demand together with renewable generation. The webinar will be organized in two different parts. First, I will go briefly, myself, Paulo Frias, will go briefly through the different business models that we have identified that were already presented in the previous webinar. At the end of this first part, I will draw the final, let's say, barriers that we found of bringing these business models into real practice in different focus countries in Europe. In the second part, my colleagues Tomás Gómez and Lorenzo Simons will present which are the policy recommendations that are needed to be acquired by regulators or policymakers in order to overcome the existing barriers. At the end of each part, we will pose a couple of questions for all of you to have a brief discussion over the topics we have identified. Of course, at the end of the webinar, Fernando will manage the different open questions that may happen along this webinar. As Fernando already mentioned, the real challenge that through the IndustRE project we are trying to face is to try to identify which are the possible win-win strategies that may happen if we bring together the flexibility of the big industry together with a possible integration of more renewable generation, mainly intermittent generation. For this part, the objective is to define which are the most suitable business models that may exploit this kind of source for revenues for the system. Once the business models are defined from a theoretical point of view, there is a need to quantify if these business models in economic terms make sense. If they do, then there is the need to identify if regulation allow these business models, and if not, to provide some kind of policy recommendations for future deployments. The first thing to define is what we understand by business model. Okay, so a business model is clearly a set of flexibility strategies chosen by the flexible industrial demand in relation to its electricity consumption in order to generate economic benefits. You can see in the table that the matrix that we build to try to classify the different business models. In rows, you can see the main sources for savings, which are the energy bill or the electricity paid for regulated payments, for network payments or other regulated payments. And also we found the revenues, and these revenues could be mainly based for system services. In columns, the three columns identify are the possibility of the interaction between the industry with renewable generation. In the first column, it's just the load flexibility of the industry which is taking place, while in the second and third columns, it is the integration of renewable generation together with the flexibility of the industry. That could be on-site, it means in the premises of the industry, or off-site, which is in another location, not really close to the industry. So if we try to fill in with this matrix, the first model arises, which is what we call Model 1, or electricity bill reduction. Here, it is clear that the industry can benefit by playing or by adjusting its load profile, the prices in the market, or through a retailer on the one hand. And on the other hand, by controlling the peak demand, it can also reduce the payments they pay for the capacity, okay, which are the usually regulated payments. The second business model is basically when we, as big industry, have some capacity for flexibility. It means in terms of power consumption and in the time that we can deliver this power, so to provide some services to the system. These services could be basically frequency control systems that can be provided directly to the system operator, or even can provide it to the distribution system operator, for instance, to solve voltage control problems or congestion management. The third business model that we identify is to build some kind of long-term arrangements between the renewable generation, which has some kind of intermittency in the production and faces also some risk in the prices they face when they go into the market, together with the industry. So there could be a win-win strategy of merging or reducing this uncertainty and this risk. The fourth business model is based on balancing service contract with off-site renewable generation. Here, if we are able to establish some kind of flexibility contract with this kind of intermittent generator, which is not located in the premises of the industry. Within this strategy, we are able, the industry could be able to respond to different signals, control signals provided by the renewable generator, so the final imbalance that both of them face into the market could be really limited or reduced. The last business model that we identify is basically self-generation or electricity bill reduction with on-site renewable generation. It means that by using renewable generation connected or located in the premises of the industrial partner, we are able to reduce the energy consumption together with some capacity payments that we could pay if they are regulated. Okay? So once these 5 business models are defined, let's go to the different barriers that we have identified. So here you see in the same slide on the one side the different business models, and on the right-hand side with different colors the regulatory barriers that we have identified in these 6 European countries. Okay? In green you can see that the business models are feasible. In red the business models are not really feasible nowadays, so there exist many barriers. And in orange it's something in between. Of course, if we go to the first business model, which is the model 1 or electricity bill reduction, it is clear that this is how most industry work nowadays. They go into the market if they could, or if not, they are able to adapt their load profile into the different retailing prices. The second business model, it is also feasible in most countries, as demand is able to participate in most balancing products, not in all countries, as you can see from the table, like Spain and Italy, where still demand cannot participate in similar conditions with generators. Of course, here load interruptibility contracts or capacity remuneration schemes are already in place in countries like the UK, France, or Belgium. The third business models, which is the contract of renewable generators together with the industry, is feasible, I would say, in most countries that we have analyzed. However, due to the current still existent remuneration of renewable generation, it is not worthy in economic terms. So there is still some need to move renewable generation more and more into the market like other conventional generation to really expose them to real market prices. The fourth business model, which is the balancing service contract with off-site renewable generation, we would say this model it's difficult in many ways. It's difficult in a way of trying to understand it. Second, in a way of current regulations do not exactly allow this to happen. Problems that we found and will be discussed by Thomas later on is, for instance, the situation of the problems with using single or double imbalance pricing, or the problem of aggregation between generation and demand, or between the different demands together at the same time, etc. So this model is still, quite hypothetical or quite theoretical in that way. And the final model, which is the electricity bill reduction with on-site renewable generation, as you know, which is one of the problems that we are facing in policy in the last years. It's about self-consumption, or more clearly self-generation. And in this way, could be attractive in most cases if, on the one hand, the energy bill could be reduced, but also if the regulated payments could be also reduced. This second part, in some countries like Spain nowadays, are nowadays cut down, so you cannot get benefits from this second part of the reduction from regulated tariffs. Anyway, there are other countries like Belgium or UK which are, let's say, promoting this kind of self-generation in order to bring more efficiency into the system. So with this, we conclude the first part, and let's directly go to the couple of questions that we want you to answer and to think about.
Who attended the webinar thought that flexibility is necessary in future power systems. Now we want to know what's, according to you, the most efficient way of providing this flexibility. That's the first question. The second question is, all people attending last week in the webinar indicated that bilateral contracts with off-site renewable generation, which is like Model 3 and Model 4, what Pablo just explained, has the lowest potential of all. We would like to know, why do you think that, what do you think that is the reason for this? Future power systems. Most of the people indicated that indeed they see that this coming from industrial demand, and also a big number of people indicated that this comes from storage, which is very interesting for us, and it kind of confirms the idea that we had with this project, that there is a big potential for industrial demand to provide the flexibility. In the second question, where we asked why, according to you, is there no bilateral potential for bilateral contracts with off-site renewable generation? Here the votes are very divided among all the possible answers. I think this kind of indicates that it's not very clear how these contracts would be established, how the regulatory framework is these days, and what is possible. Maybe we can continue with this in the final discussion at the end, and I think now we can go to the second part about the policy recommendation. The second part will be presented by Tomás Gómez and myself, Lorenzo Simón.
Okay, good afternoon. Yeah, after we have been seeing the different business models, now we are going to focus in general policy recommendations for Europe. We have to understand that this project has been developed in Europe. And also we are going to try to align these policy recommendations with the last energy package coming from the European Commission last winter. Also, we have divided these policy recommendations in different subjects, which are related with the different issues that Pablo already presented, different kind of business models. For instance, the first set of recommendations are focused on market assets, which is a very relevant issue for participating in the market in some way. And as you know, traditionally, demand has been very passive in markets. Therefore, the challenge is how we can make regulation and policies totally symmetrical. I mean, the same that generation can produce, the same demand can produce, if technically are capable. Therefore, the first thing is to ensure that demand is able to participate in energy wholesale electricity markets. This is something that is already quite common in Europe, and demand is already participating in day-ahead or intraday markets. But what it is relevant also is to clarify and to set clearly the figure of aggregators, which is not in all countries. Therefore, demand is going to be more promoted in some way to the participation in markets through this figure of aggregators. Therefore, it's important to allow participation and also to allow the figures of aggregators. And it's not so common already that demand can participate in reserve and balancing markets. This has been a barrier in some of the countries that we have analyzed. And here it's also important to include the figure of the agent, the aggregator for doing that, because technically it's much more complex. You can imagine demand reacting in few seconds because it's providing secondary reserve. That's something that could be done, but that is important to be allowed by regulation first. In line with that, it's important to recognize that the technical conditions for participating in this market should be also changed. And in this case, for instance, a typical condition that we have seen is the minimum size for participating providing reserves. This is something that is set in different countries differently, and this can be a barrier. Another barrier is the kind of products that you are able to sell. For instance, if demand is able to provide maybe upward reserve, and it's not so easy to provide downward reserve. In the market, they bought similar amounts of both quantities, and you have to provide both things together. This is a kind of barrier for participation of demand. And also, you know that in Europe we have capacity remuneration mechanisms. In some countries they were established some years ago, and they were mainly intended for generators. That is no longer the way of going ahead, because generators can provide this product, but also demand can participate on that. Therefore, it's important to open those capacity remuneration mechanisms, capacity markets, or strategic reserves. There are different forms in Europe to the participation of demand in equal terms than generators. The second set of recommendations are related with the tariff design. Tariff, we in Europe, we are talking about regulated payments that the consumer has to do. One is the network tariff, and the other one has other regulated costs. Regarding network tariffs, it's important a change of paradigm. Typically, in many countries, network tariffs are charged in terms of volumetric charges per kilowatt hour. Our recommendations here are based on economic principles, and in that case, it's important to charge incremental costs of the network, what we call, in this case, the peak coincident capacity charge. If the consumers or generators are contributing to make additional investments in the network, they have to be responsible for that. This is a cost-reflective tariff, and in this case, they have to pay according to their contribution to the peak coincident situation in the network. And that is going to be euros per kilowatt. While the rest of what we call residual network cost should be charged by a system that don't distort the energy charges or the energy prices and the peak coincident charges. And that means that mainly to pay the residual network cost by a fixed charge, which is fixed by consumers or type of consumers. And the other regulated costs, which in countries like Germany, Spain, or Italy are really important amount of money. In these cases, what we have to apply is mainly also fixed charges, but here we can use what we call the Ramsey principle, under which principle industrial consumers, due to the high elasticity to price that they present, in this case they have to be allocated the lowest cost. And in this case, the opposite could happen for residential consumers. In this way, we can use economic principles to achieve something that is also important is not trying to promote the not delocalization of the industry to other countries outside of Europe. It's another policy recommendation. In line with the subjects related with ancillary services, we have been analyzing, for instance, the interoperability mechanisms that you can find in all the countries that we have analyzed. And in this case, in these cases, some of these mechanisms, because historical reasons, were established probably even before the markets were set. And in this case, what is relevant now is to include these services as other potential services that we are more under the market on competitive mechanisms. Therefore, we are recommending here a review of the different systems that are implemented in the different countries and to include that in the general framework of market, ancillary services markets that already are very harmonized in Europe. And there is another line for future development because actually distribution system operators don't use flexibility that are connected to the distribution grid. And some of those customers are connected in transmission, but some of them are also connected in distribution. And they can help in case of distribution networks to alleviate congestion problems or voltage control problems. And in that case, that is going to be a service appreciated by the DSOs, but also should be remunerated. And for establishing the framework for that regulated area is not still, it's a pending issue in Europe. And I think in the next future we will see regulation on that. Regarding bilateral balancing here, we are in a process of harmonizing the treatment of renewable intermittent generators. Here the recommendations are quite clear in Europe, in line with the energy package, which is that those generators should bear in balance responsibility. It means they are responsible for their errors in the forecast and deviations with respect the program schedule that has been initially committed. Also is a discussion about what is more efficient, single or double or dual efficient imbalance prices. In this case, our recommendation is more going through towards single pricing, and that is something that is, as I mentioned before, is under discussion in countries. And also in case of dual imbalance prices, here aggregation should be allowed because in this case it's going to be a benefit for aggregation between generation and demand in order to compensate the imbalances from one side or the other. Therefore, if we still keep dual imbalance prices, in this case we should allow aggregation. Regarding the on-site generation, here I would say that we are in Europe quite aligned in order to abandon net metering policies. That has been a good practice initially for promoting renewable energy, but nowadays that creates problems related to, for instance, to when you net your consumption by using generation at different times, you know the value of that generation is different because the energy value is changing hour by hour. Therefore, this is kind of cross subsidies that we are doing. Also, with net consumption, reducing net consumption, you are paying less volumetric charges, networks or other regulated. This is an advantage, which doesn't create any benefit for the system, but benefit the individuals that are doing this net metering. Therefore, our recommendation here is abandon net metering, and of course, to eliminate barriers that impede in some way self-generation. And that is something that in some countries still exists. And just to finish with these general recommendations, that then we will see how we can focus those recommendations in the different countries. I would say that at the European level, we are under a harmonization process because the European Commission is leading what we call network cost development. In this case, it's very important the future balancing, energy balancing guideline, compile all of these recommendations and harmonize these balancing markets around Europe. That is going to be a process that is going to be long because nowadays the balancing markets are very different from country to country, but we are, of course, this harmonization should be based on high-level principles. I think with that, I'm going to finish my presentation, and I'm going to leave the floor to Lorenzo, who is going to present you these policy recommendations, but now in doing some separation or recommendations in the country-by-country basis.
Good, indeed. Thank you, Thomas. I will not explain exactly country by country because we did a country analysis for the 6 target countries of this project, which is Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. But what I will do is, for each category, highlight a little bit the good and bad practices that we have found in different countries, such that you all can see which regulations exist among Europe and what we think are good practices to enhance more demand response. So the first category that we discussed was market access, and there we see that an important factor here is that aggregation should be allowed. And in Belgium and the UK, independent aggregators are already very active, and therefore they are able to participate in many ancillary services or in the day-ahead market, in the case of Belgium. When we look at the opposite, and we look at Spain and Italy, there we see that aggregation is not even allowed, and therefore this is a very important barrier for demand response to participate. Also, we see that in the same countries, demand response can also not even formally participate in reserves, not through aggregation, but also not independently. Let's go to ancillary services. There, we try to focus our policy recommendations on the technical barriers. We have seen that in the UK and also in Belgium, many services have to be contracted a couple of months, sometimes a year ahead, which makes it for demand sometimes very hard to estimate which capacity they can provide. And they have to commit also immediately for a whole year or a month. Whereas sometimes demand is more subjected to some seasonality, and this can cause some problems. In this case, we like more the current way how Spain is organized, where you contract most of the ancillary services after the day-ahead market. This means that demand has a very good idea about which capacity they will have available for next day. So if demand-side participation is allowed in Spain, that barrier is not there, and we advise also other countries to evolve more in that direction. We have seen that Belgium has taken some steps by introducing the bid ladder. If you want more information on that, I can give you that after this webinar, because it's a bit complicated now. But we see that countries start to follow our policy recommendations there. Thomas already mentioned that symmetric products are a problem because demand typically finds it much harder to provide upward and downward reserve in the same quantities, and therefore our recommendation is to provide asymmetric products, which is already done in the UK at this moment, where basically when you are participating in a tender for the ancillary services, and indicate if you want to provide only upward or only downward reserve. Also here we see many countries where the obligation of symmetric products is still in place, and that makes it complicated. Then with the minimum bid size, we refer to basically participate in the energy markets, or for ancillary services, what's the minimum bid size. And for example, what's a bad practice for us is in the UK you have the fast reserve. The minimum bid size there is 50 megawatts, which is quite high for demand. Through aggregation, this is possible, but it's advisable to lower this barrier and to evolve more to a model like what they have in Belgium, where the minimum bit size very often is 1 megawatt, much more suitable for demand. And then we have the distributed, the demand on distribution level that can participate. Thomas already commented on that. In general, most of the countries need to develop more and more a framework where the DSO can already acquire these services, and where demand connected to the distribution level can participate, which is not the case at many places. Then let's go to load interruptibility here, and this depends a little bit on what you categorize as this load interruptibility services. We have seen that in Belgium, for example, here we categorize the strategic reserve, what they have there, as a load interruptibility. In Spain, you have it exactly called like that, load interruptibility. And here we see a difference that in some countries, like in Belgium, a market is organized once a year, and competitive prices are obtained. So therefore, we mark it as green, as there is no need for a recommendation. This capacity mechanism, this load interruptibility mechanism, already works quite well, although it has not really been used yet. In Spain, sometimes this is seen as more a subsidy for industry, as there are always the same industries winning these contracts, and therefore our advice is here to make it market-based, to open it for all the demand, and also to allow aggregators to participate in here, which could already make it more competitive. Then we're going to go to the tariffs, the tariff design. Here we see that many countries, well, all the countries that we have investigated have some kind of regulated charges which have nothing to do with your electricity consumption included in the tariff on kilowatt-hour basis. This distorts the right signals for market participants, and therefore advises to eliminate these regulated charges, which have nothing to do with electricity sometimes, out of the tariff, and therefore not to distort the incentives. An example here is in France. They have consumers have to pay for the pensions of EDF, and this has nothing to do with the fact of how much you consume or not. Therefore, these costs should not be included in the electricity tariff. That was just to give you an example of what kind of charges we mean here. Then a peak coincident capacity component, that's already what Thomas mentioned before. We are saying that to have an efficient tariff, at least some component of the tariff should be ex post and should look at which time of the day did the peak consumption occur in the network, and if you were consuming at that time, you should be paying for that. And so it should not depend on your own peak consumption, but like we say, peak coincident capacity component. So how much you were consuming when the system was at its peak consumption. Here we see that in the UK, they have the triad charges, which is a rather complicated system at first sight, But basically what they do is they check 3 times a year, the 3 peak times of the year, who was consuming, and they are paying for that. That's very simply explained how that mechanism works. And then we're gonna more or less round up the extra charge for self-generation. In Spain, for example, there was a charge included based on the past consumption or the expected consumption, more or less, and you have to contribute to costs that were made in the past if you have, for example, solar panels. So these costs, they have nothing to do with your current consumption or your net consumption, but they have to do with your installed capacity or with your past consumption, basically because they need to recover the cost. This also gives like a distortion and removes some of the incentives for variable renewable energy to be installed. And then the other categories, I don't know if we have time to go one by one. I think we can round up here and leave the floor for some questions. I think that's interesting. We also have 2 questions ourselves, if you can answer these, and at the same time you can formulate your own question. I know that one is gone now. So please answer those 2 questions first. I will read them, and then we are available to answer all of your questions. The first question is, regulated costs, which are not related to the cost of the network, should be charged, in your opinion, according to a fixed charge, a volumetric charge, a capacity charge, or a combination of some of them. The second question is, variable renewable energy should be, and this is about imbalance responsibility, should they be fully responsible, partially responsible, or not responsible at all for their imbalances? So the first question, if regulated costs, how they should be charged to consumers. The interesting thing is that the majority, although it's a very minor majority, has voted for volumetric charges because they say that consumers who use more electricity should pay more, which is very surprising for us, as we were saying that this kind of tariff would distort the incentives or like the right signals, efficient signals for the consumers. So here I would say that we don't agree with those 8 people who voted for volumetric charges. A combination of all of the terms would be acceptable, I think, but we prefer definitely a fixed charge for that, or out of the tariff. The second question, if renewable energy should be balance responsible. Here, also a small minority voted for partially responsible, and we think that they should be fully responsible, as they should be responsible for the costs they are causing. I don't know if Tomas wants to comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, but I think that the survey show the way of people thinking in general. What it is, sometimes it's not probably the most efficient solution for the system. And it's true that the tariffs are also related with efficiency in terms of energy efficiency. Therefore, if you are charging per kilowatt hour, well, what you are doing is giving incentives for people being more efficient in the future, right? Therefore, but this kind of efficiency in the end is also like, well, if you install your self-generation at home. In that case, I would say that this is the natural way of thinking. But it is a kind of revolution. It's going to fixed terms that in many countries even doesn't exist today, which is the case of Spain, for instance. And regarding the other thing is, well, renewable has been introduced in the system because of some support. There were economic support, but there were also technical support. And this is part of the support that the renewable energy received in the past, not being responsible for imbalances. But you can imagine that the system of generators are going to be not responsible for the imbalances. The system could not work. Therefore, in the future, when we are visualizing the system, a decarbonized system, plenty of renewable, if we want to have under control the system, we need this generator will be responsible for that. Otherwise, the control of the system and the efficiency in the system is going to be really difficult. And that is the reason why nowadays, for mature technologies, wind and solar, I think policymakers are pushing to normalize in totally, level playing field for conventional generators or renewable generators would be the case. But yeah, I would say that the answers up to now are totally natural with respect to the way of thinking of many people. Yeah.
So now let's go to the questions of you guys, and we leave the floor to Fernando to monitor these questions.